The Humanities Council of Washington, D.C. is proud to present Freedoms, Rights, and Responsibilities, a series of programs supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities We the People initiative, dedicated to exploring significant themes and events in U.S. history and sharing the lessons with all Americans.
Welcome to Humanities Profile. My name is Ethelbert Miller, and my guest today is E.J. Dionne. Mr. Dionne is one of America's leading columnists. He began his twice-weekly op-ed column for the Washington Post in 1993. He's the author of Why Americans Hate Politics, as well as They Only Look Dead, Why Progressives Will Dominate the Next Political Era. In 2004, he wrote Stand Up, Fight Back, Republicans Tough, Democratic Wimps, and the Politics of Revenge. Our program today is part of the National Endowment for the Humanities We the People initiative, a project that helps us look at some of the important documents which define us as Americans. Today, E.J. Dionne and I will be looking at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. Welcome, E.J.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You know, I thought, since I'm in your office, that I begin by having you talk about the Bill of Rights first before we discuss the 13th and 14th Amendments. Let's look at the Bill of Rights and how important are they to you as an American and as a journalist and writer?
Well, you know, I tell my kids all the time, I am fairly critical of the administration most of the time. And I tell my kids that one of the great things about our country, no matter how frustrated people get with the way things are going, somebody can't just knock on our door and throw me in jail or somebody else in jail just because they disagree with the government. That is not true in all parts of the world. Many parts of the world for a long time, you didn't have any right like that at all. It also guarantees freedom of religion. And, you know, our family, like most Americans, has a very diverse group of friends who subscribe to many faiths and none. And, you know, I talk to my kids about that, too, that you know, religious freedom is something that we take for granted and we shouldn't. Or the freedom of assembly. You know, when I was younger, I was involved in the anti-war movement like a lot of other people. And we had a right to sort of make this statement. Whether it helped the cause or not, you can debate, but we had a right to do that. So, you know, the notion that you have that freedom, no matter how messed up things get, that's a remarkable thing we have in our country. And I think what we have is some capacity for self-correction. You know, one of my favorite, Jesse Jackson had this great line where he said, "God isn't finished with me yet." And I always like that line because it implies, you know, a personal capacity for reform, renewal, and redemption. But that's also about a country. God is not finished with us yet. And so if you have a certain amount of freedom, you have some capacity to correct your course. So we did get rid of slavery. We did get rid of some of the economic injustice, surely not all. And without that freedom, you can't correct yourself.
Well, let me ask you this, because we see many journalists today, you know, being concerned about things like censorship, you know, because of the political climate. Do you see yourself being concerned about maybe being placed on some type of list here in the country?
I don't know. I mean, I doubt. I know some people have me on a list that they don't like what I write. I get a lot of email, and there are a lot of people, you know, who disagree with what I write. And I have a line I often use when somebody writes disagreeing with me, where I just write back saying, "Look, disagreement is one of the joys of freedom." So I don't worry. You know, yes, we have had a time when opponents of the government got their taxes audited, or bad things happened to them. On the whole, I feel like my rights are, on the whole, protected. You know, and I hope and expect that we're going to stay like that.
You know, many nations look to our model of government. Are the ideas in our Constitution something everyone in the world should follow, or is the Constitution simply a document unique to our culture and our history?
Well, the form of our democracy is unique to us, it's not unique to us, but it's very much a product of our culture. I mean, very few countries had the struggle over slavery and racial justice the way we had, and that shaped the very content of the Constitution. When you look at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we were one of the earliest republics in history, so that the form of our Constitution really comes out of a certain, Enlightenment tradition back from the 17th and 18th centuries. And so not everything in our Constitution would be repeated everywhere, but it's one thing I do agree with the President on. I think there is some universal instinct for freedom, and I think there is a universal desire for self-determination, if you will. And so to that extent, I do believe these ideas are more than just culturally conditioned or more than just part of our history. I think you've had struggles all over the world aimed at achieving some sense of freedom and some sense of a democratic rule.
When we look at the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, we notice that within a 5-year period, 1865 to 1870, these amendments are passed. It's obvious the Civil War shaped these amendments. Could you talk about that climate at this particular time in our country's history?
Right. Well, without those amendments, the Bill of Rights would not have applied to most Americans, and in some ways, the Bill of Rights wouldn't have the kind of bite they have, wouldn't have the authority they have. And we had just come off a bitter civil war, which was about states' rights, yes, but in the end, and I think historically most people would agree, it was about slavery, and it was about relations between blacks and whites. And these amendments came out of an extraordinarily idealistic moment in our history, where Reconstruction has gone through lots of revisionism in the history books. And there was a period in the 20s and 30s where people were saying, these were terrible, corrupt governments. These were amazing governments. These were governments where, for the first time, people who had been slaves suddenly had the capacity to get elected to office. They had representation in their state governments. And so you had this idealistic moment, which we get occasionally in our history. Now, I think you can sort of compare that period in a way to the Civil Rights period, where we look at our national creed and we say we're not really living up to those words we like to recite. And I think those amendments, obviously the 13th getting rid of slavery, the 14th Amendment was particularly important because this whole notion of guaranteeing equal protection for everyone, it basically said no state can deprive someone of the most basic rights. It essentially codified the Bill of Rights all over the country, with the force of the federal government behind it.
But let's look at this, because when we look at these amendments and going back to the Civil War and what we now deal with in terms of Reconstruction, we know, and I guess especially as a journalist, deals are being made. Okay, so I mean, we can look at these amendments being passed, but what are some of the politics in terms of one being nice to the South? I mean, you're dealing with the whole thing of reconstructing the country, and people want to maintain power. People are looking in terms of what to do with the newly emancipated slave. What about the politics behind these amendments?
Well, there was enormous politics, as you're exactly right, because on the one hand, you had some people in the North basically wanted not to have a kind of radical reconstruction of the South, and that their main purpose had been to reunite the Union. And you never really know where Lincoln would have ended up on this. His first words were clearly conciliatory. There are those who say the radical Republicans, as they were known, were beyond where Lincoln would have ended up. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not true.
The Humanities Council of Washington, D.C. is proud to present Freedoms, Rights, and Responsibilities, a series of programs supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities We the People initiative, dedicated to exploring significant themes and events in U.S. history and sharing the lessons with all Americans.
Welcome to Humanities Profile. My name is Ethelbert Miller, and my guest today is E.J. Dionne. Mr. Dionne is one of America's leading columnists. He began his twice-weekly op-ed column for the Washington Post in 1993. He's the author of Why Americans Hate Politics, as well as They'll Only Look Dead, Why Progressives Will Dominate the Next Political Era. In 2004, he wrote Stand Up, Fight Back, Republicans Tough, Democratic Wimps, and the Politics of Revenge. Our program today is part of the National Endowment for the Humanities We the People initiative, a project that helps us look at some of the important documents which define us as Americans. Today, E.J. Dionne and I will be looking at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. Welcome, E.J.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You know, I thought since I'm in your office that I'd begin by having you talk about the Bill of Rights first before we discuss the 13th and 14th Amendments. Let's look at the Bill of Rights and how important are they to you as an American and as a journalist and writer?
Well, you know, I tell my kids all the time, I am fairly critical of the administration most of the time, and I tell my kids that one of the great things about our country, no matter how frustrated people get with the way things are going, somebody can't just knock on our door and throw me in jail or somebody else in jail just because they disagree with the government. That is not true in all parts of the world. Many parts of the world for a long time, you didn't have any right like that at all. It also guarantees freedom of religion. And, you know, our family, like most Americans, has a very diverse group of friends who has subscribed to many faiths and none. And, you know, I talk to my kids about that too, that you know, religious freedom is something that we take for granted and we shouldn't. Or the freedom of assembly. You know, when I was younger, I was involved in the anti-war movement like a lot of other people. And we had a right to sort of make this statement. Whether it helped the cause or not, you can debate, but we had a right to do that. So, you know, the notion that you have that freedom, no matter how messed up things get, that's a remarkable thing we have in our country. And I think what we have is some capacity for self-correction. You know, one of my favorite, Jesse Jackson had this great line where he said, "God isn't finished with me yet." And I always like that line because it implies, you know, a personal capacity for reform, renewal, and redemption. But that's also about a country. God is not finished with us yet. And so if you have a certain amount of freedom, you have some capacity to correct your course. So we did get rid of slavery. We did get rid of some of the economic injustice, surely not all. And without that freedom, you can't correct yourself.
Well, let me ask you this, because we see many journalists today, you know, being concerned about things like censorship, you know, because of the political climate. Do you see yourself being concerned about maybe being placed on some type of list here in the country?
I don't know. I mean, I doubt. I know some people have me on a list that they don't like what I write. I get a lot of email, and there are a lot of people, you know, who disagree with what I write. And I have a line I often use when somebody writes disagreeing with me, where I just write back saying, "Look, disagreement is one of the joys of freedom." So I don't worry. You know, yes, we have had a time when opponents of the government got their taxes audited, or bad things happened to them. On the whole, I feel like my rights are, on the whole, protected. You know, and I hope and expect that we're going to stay like that.
You know, many nations look to our model of government. Are the ideas in our Constitution something everyone in the world should follow, or is the Constitution simply a document unique to our culture and our history?
Well, the form of our democracy is unique to us, or it's not unique to us, but it's very much a product of our culture. I mean, very few countries had the struggle over slavery and racial justice the way we had, and that shaped the very content of the Constitution. When you look at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we were one of the earliest republics in history, so that the form of our Constitution really comes out of a certain, Enlightenment tradition back from the 17th and 18th centuries. And so not everything in our Constitution would be repeated everywhere, but it's one thing I do agree with the President on. I think there is some universal instinct for freedom, and I think there is a universal desire for self-determination, if you will. And so to that extent, I do believe these ideas are more than just culturally conditioned or more than just part of our history. I think you've had struggles all over the world aimed at achieving some sense of freedom and some sense of a democratic rule.
When we look at the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, we notice that within a 5-year period, 1865 to 1870, these amendments are passed. It's obvious the Civil War shaped these amendments. Could you talk about that climate at this particular time in our country's history?
Right. Well, without those amendments, the Bill of Rights would not have applied to most Americans, and in some ways, the Bill of Rights wouldn't have the kind of bite they have, wouldn't have the authority they have. And we had just come off a bitter Civil War, which was about states' rights, yes, but in the end, and I think historically most people would agree, it was about slavery, and it was about relations between blacks and whites. And these amendments came out of an extraordinarily idealistic moment in our history, where Reconstruction has gone through lots of revisionism in the history books. And there was a period in the 20s and 30s where people were saying, these were terrible, corrupt governments. These were amazing governments. These were governments where, for the first time, people who had been slaves suddenly had the capacity to get elected to office. They had representation in their state governments. And so you had this idealistic moment, which we get occasionally in our history. Now, I think you can sort of compare that period in a way to the Civil Rights period, where we look at our national creed and we say we're not really living up to those words we like to recite. And I think those amendments, obviously the 13th, getting rid of slavery, the 14th Amendment was particularly important because this whole notion of guaranteeing equal protection for everyone, it basically said no state can deprive someone of the most basic rights. It essentially codified the Bill of Rights all over the country, with the force of the federal government behind it.
But let's look at this, because when we look at these amendments and going back to the Civil War and what we now deal with in terms of Reconstruction, we know, and I guess especially as a journalist, deals are being made. Okay, so I mean, we can look at these amendments being passed, but what are some of the politics in terms of one being nice to the South? I mean, you're dealing with the whole thing of reconstructing the country, and people want to maintain power. People are looking in terms of what to do with the newly emancipated slave. What about the politics behind these amendments?
Well, there was enormous politics, as you're exactly right, because on the one hand, you had some people in the North basically wanted not to have a kind of radical reconstruction of the South, and that their main purpose had been to reunite the Union. And you never really know where Lincoln would have ended up on this. His first words were clearly conciliatory. There are those who say the radical Republicans, as they were known, were beyond where Lincoln would have ended up. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not true. But there were those who wanted a kind of soft reconstruction, did not want to have a kind of social revolution in the South. But there were others, both within the African-American community in the South and in the North, who wanted this to be, something much more radical, something much more about reconstructing society from the bottom. There was talk about land reform, and there was for a while significant land reform in the South. And then there were the party fights that the Democrats, who were then the party of white supremacy on the whole, there were some anti-slavery Democrats, but a lot of them had gone over to Lincoln's party at that point. And so the Democrats were not wild about enfranchising slaves because they knew that this would be a Republican vote nationwide. There were certain Republicans were kind of torn about this, and it's a kind of sad part of the history, I think, where the white North, after a while, gave up on the Reconstruction project. And we slowly, from sort of the late 1870s through perhaps, wherever you want to date the end of this with the reemergence of Jim Crow, the country kind of gave up on this project of racial equality. We were for it in principle, but we weren't really pushing it, and it took another 100 years to the civil rights days to kind of rediscover that.
But if you go back, we also are telling these southern states that had rebelled, who had left the Union, that if you're going to come back into the Union, you're going to have to agree with these amendments.
Right. It was a condition of coming back in the country, and that's why it was a kind of social. The Civil War was a social revolution in the country. It really did, in some very important ways, change the whole social structure of the South. Not just obviously getting rid of slavery did that, but also there were some really pretty radical egalitarian ideas floating around at that time. And so, yes, it was in a sense imposed by force. But what were you really imposing by force? In a sense, you were imposing majority rule by force. You were basically saying in some of the states where there was an African-American majority, you were saying, no, the white minority is not permitted to hold all of the political power. Power has got to be shared across the lines of race.
Let me read you a quote by Howard Zinn from a Zinn Reader published in 1997 and have you respond to it. And this is what Howard Zinn writes. But these amendments were soon ignored as blacks were kept in semi-slavery in the South, segregated, humiliated, beaten, lynched by mobs, unprotected by either the local police or the national government. For almost 100 years after the 14th Amendment became law, every president, whether liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat, violated his oath of office, his pledge to uphold the Constitution, by failing to enforce those amendments, and the Supreme Court interpreted them so to make them useless. Now, Howard Zinn is a radical journalist and historian. I mean, but that's a very strong statement.
Well, there is something to that. What happened, I mean, the key event was the election of 1876, and we all revisited for a little bit the election of 1876 with Bush v. Gore. That was the last really seriously disputed election in our history. And essentially, that election produced a political bargain where the Democrats and the South agreed to let the Republican win, even though he had lost to the popular vote in 3 states. In 3 states, there was a great dispute over who actually won those states. Each side charged the other with corruption. And so the bargain was the Democrats had let Rutherford Hayes become president in exchange for ending Reconstruction, for pulling the troops out of the South. And so, what Zinn writes is, in a broad sense, true, that gradually, from 1876 forward, the whole commitment to this amazing project that existed in the Reconstruction years, that commitment, the country pulled away from that commitment, all the way to the point where you got Plessy v. Ferguson, which ratified racial segregation. You had more and more efforts to knock African Americans off the voter rolls. You also were, in some states, knocking poor whites off the voter rolls as well. And you really did return. You didn't go all the way back to slavery, thank God, but you were not fully enforcing either the letter or the spirit of these amendments, which is why the civil rights agitation began really in the 1940s, which was an effort to say, wait a minute, we've let go of what we promised back in 1865 and 1866 all the way through to 1870. We just forgot about that as a country. I mean, forget is probably a charitable way to put it, but we did. And but the beauty, I think, of having a certain set of ideals is they're always there to make you have a bad conscience about something. I always say I'm a Catholic and I actually believe in guilt, and that that you ought to live up to the content of your creed. And I think both Lincoln, in the way he spoke, and Martin Luther King in the way he spoke, kept repairing back to the founding documents. Both were, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And it seems to me if you have founding ideas that point you in the direction of equality and democracy, eventually those ideas, stick their heads up over the ramparts and have a chance of winning again.
Let's look at each amendment closely. Let's begin with the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, and it was ratified on December 6, 1865. How is this amendment different from the Emancipation Proclamation?
Well, this amendment simply made it impossible for slavery to come back. That the Emancipation Proclamation was a presidential order. It was done in the middle of the Civil War. It was a combination of a principled decision and a practical political decision. You know, that when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, there had been a lot of discussion about whether the Union armies would be helped by having emancipated slaves on their side. So it was a practical thing from the point of view of the Union after a lot of debate in the North. And it was obviously a strong moral statement. And once in a while, you know, we always think in politics that the politician who does the practical thing, it can lead him to do the wrong thing. In this case, the practical thing led Lincoln to do the right thing. You know, the 13th Amendment said that, you know, the Civil War, which people said was primarily about states' rights, really was in the end about slavery, because by enshrining it in this document, in our Constitution, and it's remarkable, by the way, that at that point in 1865, it was only the 13th Amendment. We do not change this Constitution lightly.
Right.
So it was as strong a legal foundation for the end of slavery as you could possibly have, and it came right after the Civil War, which I think changed people's interpretation of the Civil War in the end, that it became much more about the fight against slavery than people might have thought it was when the war started.
You know, in the late 1960s and early 70s, a number of people involved in prison rights issues often made reference to the 13th Amendment because about what it says about U.S. prisoners being submitted to involuntary servitude. And it seems as if the Constitution does not protect the rights of American prisoners.
Well, that term, involuntary servitude, it's actually a very powerful term when you think about it. You know, because during the, you know, people have used it to criticize draft laws. You know, you're right, it was used in terms of prisoners. And so it is a very strong commitment. And that, again, you know, almost, there's so many issues in our history that we sort of end up having to go back to. You know, prison reform and the treatment of prisoners is something, as a country, we were discussing before the Civil War. You know, and that we have always had movements for prison reform. And I think, you know, the way we treat the imprisoned and the way we treat the old and the young end up being sort of powerful indicators of what our morality is as a country. And so when we look at the conditions in prisons and say, wait a minute, is this the way we want to represent ourselves to ourselves and the rest of the world?
Let me ask you this question. Should a prisoner lose his or her rights to vote?
I guess my view is a prisoner, it's legitimate to deny a prisoner the right to vote. It's not legitimate to deny an ex-prisoner the right to vote. In other words, I think that, you know, if I had my way, I'd probably let everybody vote. But I understand the principle that says if you violate the law, you give up your voting rights for a certain time. I can at least see that as an argument. I cannot see any...
Expand on that, okay.
Well, in other words, that there is a, you know, does the society have a right to impose certain penalties on people who break certain laws? I think they do have that right. There's this sort of small D Democrat in me kind of rebels against the idea and says everybody ought to be able to vote, including prisoners. But when somebody violates certain basic moral norms, whether, you know, in assault and battery, doing something to somebody else, I can see why society would say, look, it's all right for this fixed period to deny that person the franchise. But you cannot do what we did a step beyond that, which is to deny ex-prisoners the right to vote. And there's a slow movement now, finally, to try to get that right back. It seems to me once you have done your time, once you have sort of, you know, paid society back, if you will, for what you did wrong, you cannot be deprived of your rights for the rest of your life. And it's very clear that those laws were partly designed in some states to reduce the number of African Americans on the voter rolls, because it was just it was.
I was going to raise that point because when you look at our prison population, heavily African American, it seems that at the same time we're disenfranchising people. That if you come out, you know, you have no voting rights.
Right, no, and that's wrong. And I think, you know, even a couple of Republican governors began to sign bills to sort of restore the voting rights to, you know, it's usually most states define it in terms of felonies. And, you know, it just seems to me you cannot say to somebody that, you know, we're going to restore you all your civil rights when you get out of prison except the right to vote. What sense does that make? And it is, you know, it singles out a particular group of Americans, tend to be on the whole more African American, tend to be on the whole less privileged. You can't keep a whole class of people off the voter rolls like that. And I hope this movement builds over time so that we get rid of those laws, because the motivations behind them in the first place were bad.
How might this amendment now be used in our battle against terrorism?
About involuntary
Right.
involuntary servitude.
Right.
We connect everything to terrorism these days, I suppose. If you see an immediate connection, I got to tell you honestly, I don't.
Okay. No, you never know in terms of one, if for example, you define somebody a certain way, for example, then you have the Constitution backing you up. You have these amendments.
Well, I tell you where it might be relevant in sort of world politics. There has been a reappearance of slavery or virtual slavery in various parts of the world. I mean, one of the things, in a political climate that is very, very polarized, one of the handful of really heartening developments is you've seen a lot of religious people from left to right sort of unite around a program of guaranteeing sort of human rights in the world. Those rights include opposition to sort of the sex trade, which becomes a kind of slavery, but also people who live in, have to work under conditions that are very close to involuntary servitude. And I think as a country to pass the 13th Amendment, we ought to, it ought to be our role, not necessarily through force, but through our influence in the world, through the laws we pass, to try to end actual slavery and virtual slavery in other parts of the world. We came under proper pressure from the rest of the world when we had slavery. I think this is an entirely legitimate thing for the world community to press other nations on.
Let's look at the 14th Amendment, which provides citizenship for men. And let's talk about the policies behind the passing of this amendment, because in this amendment, we look closely, one cannot hold a political office if one had engaged in, say, insurrection or rebellion. So there's certain limits here. But I know that when the 14th Amendment was passed, many women were really upset with this.
In our country, it took a very long time to fully extend democratic rights. When you, again, if you want to be kind of optimistic about it, the history of the United States is one long struggle to take a very imperfect democracy and steadily make it more democratic. You really didn't have the strong movement for women's suffrage until the end of the 19th century, and then it really gathered steam until women got the vote. I guess Wyoming in 1890 was the first state, if I got the date right, the first state to give women the right to vote. It's very interesting, by the way, in terms of the cliches we have in our head. A lot of those western states that sometimes appear these days on the map as red states were among the most progressive states of the country on a lot of issues, including women's suffrage. That section about insurrection was obviously directed at Confederates.
Right.
And, there is a provision that also said that Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. And as time went on, most of the people who had been part of the Confederate Army got their voting rights restored. But that was, obviously, in part a substantive thing and in part a political thing, because it disenfranchised some of the most, I don't know if you can apply today's terms to this, sort of conservative or more segregationist or old pro-slavery elements in the South. But they eventually got their rights back.
Let's look at this today, and because we look at power and politics, how important is citizenship? We have people who want to be U.S. citizens. We have people who say, well, if you're not a citizen, you don't belong here. How important is citizenship in terms of for a country?
I think citizenship is central because it defines your relationship to everybody else in the country, and it defines you as a person who carries rights, carries specific rights that a non-citizen would not have. If the government has a right to deport you, then all the rights in the world don't do you much good. And that I think the U.S. has always had, a very strong sense of rights. I've always been kind of uneasy, for example, with certain kinds of guest worker programs in the country.
Well, let's look at that, because what happens is that if we look at today's world, you see this movement of people looking for better jobs, things of that sort. Somebody crosses a river or a border. It seems that there should be at least some protection, because the movement of labor has changed. That perhaps now the whole thing of borders and keeping people out, or the fact that we don't have like universal citizenship, should be questioned.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think if you look at the Europeans, we have all kinds of problems in our country, but I think on the issue of immigration, we have on the whole done a better job because we had this strong notion of citizenship, because we assumed that eventually people who came here would become American citizens with full and equal rights. And, Europe has had a lot of, if you will, migrant labor, and I want to get to the fact we didn't always live by this either, but Europe has had a lot of people who enter countries who have the right to work, don't have voting rights, don't have the rights to influence, the political direction of the country. And I think our system of, making it relatively easy, it's not easy, but at least having citizenship open to immigrants is hugely important. And that's why we struggle so much now with immigration. I mean, the problem with undocumented immigrants or illegal aliens, depending on which side of this issue you're on, is that you end up with millions of people who not only got here, against the law, but I think more importantly, millions of people who cannot exercise any of their rights. And I think it's one of the striking things that's happened in the last 10 years that the labor movement, the unions, have actually moved very much on this issue because they have looked at particularly Latinos, many of whom do blue-collar jobs, some of which are organized by unions, and the unions have said, well, we got to be on the side of these folks to figure out how they have a chance to exercise their rights, because obviously if they don't have the right to exercise their rights, in the end it undermines the rights held by others.
Let's look at the Latino community. Should there be a language requirement? Should you, for example, in terms of citizenship, do you have to speak English?
Well, I sit here as somebody whose first language was French. My people came, I was born in the U.S., my parents were born in the U.S., but my people came over the border from Quebec. And in those communities in New England where I grew up, and a lot of the old factory towns, the French-Canadian immigrants kept the language much longer. We were, in many ways, we were like Puerto Ricans because we had a lot of back and forth over the border, just like Puerto Ricans from New York had a lot of back and forth between New York and Puerto Rico. And eventually, we all did learn how to speak English. I remember my father used to tell a story, my late dad, that he spoke very accented English as a little kid.
Right.
And in other words, I think there's a natural process through which anybody who wants to make it in this society understands that English is the common language. And, I know there were people worried that, English is going to disappear, Spanish is going to become the dominant language. I don't think that's going to happen. I think a lot of us are going to learn to speak both English and Spanish, but I don't object to that.
Right, but should it be a requirement if you're applying for citizenship?
Should English speaking be a formal requirement?
Right.
Well, you're going to pass some of these citizenship tests.
Should those tests be in English or Spanish?
It's a good question. I mean, I am, partly because English is not my own first language, I'm kind of open to people who speak other languages. That's sort of my gut instinct. I do think eventually it is very useful for anybody in the country to learn English. I mean, what you're raising, I think, is a really important and difficult problem, which is how do you have a free country that simultaneously values diversity and also has a set of common values and a common sense of a sense of a common project? How do you keep those two things together? And it's because you could argue that our belief in the rights of minorities, of all kinds, political minorities, racial minorities, ethnic minorities, is rooted in a really kind of universalist sense that every human being is endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, as it says in the Declaration. And so even if you are friendly to particularism and you say people ought to have a right to maintain the integrity of their communities, it is still based on a kind of universalist concept. And a friend of mine, Todd Gitlin, wrote a book called The Twilight of Common Dreams. And I think that, in the last 20 years, we've had a real struggle, and I don't think it's an unhealthy struggle, a real struggle between this issue of particularism and universality. And I think for a country to hold together, we do need to respect the rights of minorities and other communities, but we also do need a set of common dreams. And I think we always struggle with that. And I think America may uniquely have struggled with that because, in a way we were conceived in sin, with slavery sitting side by side with this Declaration of Freedom. So, in some ways that's a cost for us, but it also, and it was surely a cost for a lot of people, but it also, I think, makes us more sensitive than we would be or other countries are to, the possibility of evil and to the difficulty of balancing sort of the universal and the particular.
This moves me into the next amendment, and I think you'll see these questions I'll raise again with you. When we deal with voting rights now, we know that many times states, in terms of carrying out these amendments, can come up with all sorts of little games in terms of preventing people from having their voting rights. So when we look at the passing of the 15th Amendment in 1870, we know that when it gets into the second part of the amendment in terms of now, Congress and states have to now implement a way of processing this, making this work. People come up with whether poll tax, property, all these sort of requirements to make people jump through hoops so that they can't vote.
And now these new rules down in Georgia, where you have to have an ID card, right, which looks like a mild version of the old poll tax.
Right.
And no, again, I think this goes back to that issue of what we say we believe and what we actually do. And when you talk about a document like the Constitution, I think one of the things maybe we forget is how much the Constitution itself is unenforceable without political action. We kind of want to act as if the Constitution just sits there and it guarantees. It's sort of like an ATM machine. If you press a button, it'll give you your rights. And that just to go to your point, it took years of struggle on the part of a lot of people to say, wait a minute, this poll tax totally violates the spirit of the 15th Amendment. And, you could say that and you could make the argument, but it wasn't until there was there were cases brought to court, there were actions in Congress, and then finally with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, did you really realize the content of that 15th Amendment? Without the political action, it wouldn't have happened. Even a court decision all by itself is not necessarily self-enforcing. The government still has to enforce that, and the government in a free country only acts when there is political pressure to force it to act.
Were you surprised recently when George Bush said that he was all in favor for extending and renewing the Civil Rights Act in 2007?
Well, I wasn't surprised. I mean, politically, politically, we have reached at least the following point. We've at least reached the point where, as a country, we're not going to go back on certain promises altogether. I don't think you're ever going to see a politician sort of formally endorse segregation. You're not going to see a politician say, we don't want to have equal voting laws and such. I think you will see a real fight over the contents of the Voting Rights Act. There are some southern states that, it affects mostly, though not exclusively, southern states. It affects some counties outside the South. Who say, well, look, it's a long time from the Civil Rights days. We shouldn't have to have these plans of ours cleared by the federal government. So you'll have some political pushback. But I think there is a kind of deep consensus that's going to be very hard to shake. And very hard to challenge frontally. It might be challenged sideways, it might be chipped away at, but I think it's going to be very hard for anybody to frontally challenge this civil rights consensus.
We started talking about the Civil War, we started talking about Reconstruction, and we discussed how there were politics involved in terms of the North dealing with the South in terms of coming back into the Union. We're sitting here, in 2005, getting ready to go into 2006, in which we know that the Republican Party pretty much dominates, three branches of government. Now we have cases dealing with redistricting, like in Texas, okay, where all of a sudden you see people being moved around to probably, dilute the power of their vote, okay. Isn't there a concern in terms of democracy and what's happening in terms of, once again, we have the amendment, but are we implementing it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, and in fact, there was a front page story in the Washington Post about a week before we were speaking here, which was about the staff of the Justice Department saying that this redistricting plan in Texas violated, in their view, the provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And then the people on top of them overruled them and said, no, this plan passes muster. Now, think about the following. 25 years ago, there was no process like that. 25 years ago, it wouldn't have even gone to the Justice Department. Let's say it's longer than 25 years ago. I'm getting I'm trying to be younger than I actually am here. Before 1965, you wouldn't have had any of these things happen. So there wouldn't have even been a scandal about it. There wouldn't have even been a ruckus about it. And the fact that there is a ruckus, the fact that people can raise these questions, the fact that we are looking carefully at whether districts are drawn in a way that ensure minority representation. That suggests a very big change in our culture. It used to be uncontroversial to draw districts in ways that diluted the votes of minorities. Now, at least we're arguing about, we're sort of well down the road where we're arguing about whether the number of minority representatives in Texas is big enough, as opposed to whether there should be any. Now, I don't want to be a Pollyanna about this. Obviously, I think, as I say, I think preserving freedom is a continuing struggle, and you can never give up on it. But I think it is amazing when you think, just in my lifetime, your lifetime, how we managed to take these words and make them, get ourselves closer to the point where we're living by the words on these pages.
Talking about the words on these pages, if we look back on what we just lived through, I'm looking specifically in terms of Florida, how important is that decision that was made in terms of that presidential election, in terms of the voting rights of people in Florida? It seems like it went all the way to the Supreme Court. Was there a violation of people's rights?
There's almost nothing the Supreme Court has done in my lifetime that made me more upset than that decision in Bush v. Gore. It upset me on a whole series of levels. It upset me, level one, that decision claimed to be worried about equal protection, and you had justices voting for the pro-Bush result using equal protection who had routinely rejected equal protection rationales in other cases, but it suddenly was convenient in this case. Secondly, they used equal protection without looking into the fact that it's clearly established that a very significant number of voters in Florida lost their votes, because of faulty ballot design. In some cases, you can't blame all that on the Republicans. In some cases, it was badly designed ballots in Democratic areas. But if there was an equal protection problem, shouldn't we examine the problem of all those people who did lose their votes? And it was, thirdly, here's a court that says it respects and admires states' rights, but when it was convenient for political reasons to overturn a state court, they just did it. And I know a lot of people, including some really, pretty firmly Republican lawyers, who say, in the end, this was not at all a principled decision. This was an unprincipled decision. And I think it's people are going to look back on that and say this was, a political act. It was not a judicial act. I actually edited a book on Bush v. Gore with a conservative friend because I just wanted to enshrine this argument, because I hope we never forget that moment, because I hope we never do anything like that again.
When we look at these amendments and we look at, sort of protecting our rights, how does it break down in terms of responsibility of states as well as the federal government? It seems as, especially in some parts of our country, there has to be a federal presence if we're going to make sure our rights are protected. We can't leave it to the states.
Well, I think we learned that, for a long time. I mean, it's an unfortunate thing. The whole argument about states' rights is so, it sort of drips with our traditions of, our old and rejected traditions of slavery and segregation. States' rights became a slogan to defend first slavery and then segregation, which is terribly unfortunate, because the notion that some power should be decentralized is a good notion. The notion that some decisions are best made closest to the people, that's a good notion. And so federalism as an idea is a very good idea. And, especially in places where you're dealing with significant minorities who are geographically concentrated, if you don't have federalism, you can have the majority violating their rights. But instead, federalism in our political argument, the states' rights got perverted as a rationale for segregation and earlier slavery. And so that's when we realized we do need a strong federal government to enforce rights. And again, that's why these amendments are so important, because they codify that the federal government does have the right to enforce individual rights over and against states if states violate those individual rights. So they're a kind of check on the abuse of local authority. And you got to have that in a free country, because local elites, local dominant groups, politically dominant groups will be tempted, human nature being what it is, to violate somebody's rights. And so this gives the feds the power to say, no, you can't do that.
I'm going to ask you two more questions. 6 weeks after 9/11, our nation passed the Patriot Act. and it passed into law on October 24th, 2001. How did this act influence how we govern ourselves today?
You know, I never liked the idea of passing laws when we're in a kind of panicked state. And at least the Congress realized that if you're going to pass a law like this after 9/11, they put a time limit on it. And at least now we are having the debate over the Patriot Act that we probably should have had immediately after 9/11, but we're not inclined to because, because we had this sense of national unity, we had this sense of legitimate fear. We didn't know what was going to happen. Now at least we're debating it, and I was struck, as we sit here, we can't know how this new debate over the Patriot Act is going to come out, but just looking at the paper this afternoon, looking online this afternoon, there's a group of 3 fairly conservative Republicans and 3 fairly liberal Democrats saying, no, we shouldn't pass all these provisions again, and there was pressure to put some time limits on them again. In some cases, parts of the Patriot Act probably modernize law enforcement. In other cases, they raise real rights questions. The ones about libraries. My late mom was a librarian, so I'm probably sensitive to that library provision. But, there are things there that we really want to do much more carefully. So again, Congress, we have not always lived up to this document of ours. And sometimes we needed the courts to step in, and sometimes we've needed just changes in our politics to make us live up to it.
The last question is a big question. If we look at the amount of time between the 12th Amendment and the 13th Amendment, quite a number of years. How often and when should we amend the Constitution? We hear, for example, passing an amendment in terms of like defining marriage. Or are there certain issues that perhaps should not be amendments?
Well, it's a great and in some ways unanswerable question. We have, on the whole, found that the Constitution is rigid enough to protect our rights and flexible enough to let us govern ourselves in an effective way. I am kind of sympathetic to Justice Stephen Breyer's notion that the purpose of the Constitution is to guarantee active liberty, and that at the heart of the Constitution is the idea that we have democratic rights that we should be encouraged to exercise. Now, that's different from saying anything goes, that Congress can pass anything, but it does imply that we do have the right to band together to solve our problems. And so, you've had some amendments that were sort of simply practical amendments. The Electoral College didn't work well in the first instance, so we amended it. If I had my way, I'd amend the Constitution to have a direct election of the president. I'd get rid of the Electoral College. I worry about any amendment that's designed to abridge rights, which is why I would hate the idea of an amendment to ban the burning of an American flag. I hate flag burners because they created this issue. Norman Thomas, the great American socialist, said during the Vietnam years, what if the opponents of the war had symbolic flag washings instead of burning it? And what a message that would send about their cause. So I don't like flag burning, but we shouldn't amend the Constitution to abridge that right. I don't like the idea of amending the Constitution on gay marriage, because there it would be targeting one group of Americans. That would be the effect of it. I understand why we're going to have a big debate on gay marriage. I just don't want that in the Constitution. I don't think it's going to get there either, because I think plenty of conservatives who, in their heart of hearts, even if they're uncomfortable with gay marriage, they don't like the idea of using the Constitution against another group.
Now, how will religion perhaps shape this future? In terms of, we see the strength of religious groups, in terms of the power they have, in terms of changing our laws.
Well, religion has been important to us as a country throughout our history. And religion's influence is not just in one direction or another. That my friend Jim Wallace and his group put out bumper stickers that say, God is not a Republican or a Democrat. And that if you look at our history, religion and religious movements have often been on the side of justice. The abolitionist movement was rooted in evangelical religion. The civil rights movement used the African American church as a critical part of
What about the
base.
separation of church and state in our society?
But separating church and state is not the same as separating religion from politics. In his book, Jerry Falwell quotes himself having once said that preachers should be soul winners, not politicians. Well, he was attacking Dr. King.
Okay.
And he was attacking the civil rights leaders because, well, you weren't supposed to drag that kind of politics into religion. So I am probably, on the whole more open than some liberals to the notion that, religion is always going to have an influence. I know my own views on poverty and equal rights are shaped by my religious views. My view of segregation was shaped by a nun who got thrown out of her parish in the South because she organized a biracial First Communion service. And so I don't view religion as automatically dangerous. Now, religious people are going to have all kinds of views, and there are some religious people who are going to try to impose certain things that I may disagree with. I think where you draw the line, or at least where I draw the line, is that in a pluralistic society where there are lots of people who believe in many different religions and in no religion at all, that I can't come to you and say, I'm for this because the Bible says it and you've got to agree, or I'm for this because God told me and you've got to agree with that. I have to say, look, this is the source of my view. I feel the way I do about the poor, partly because of what Jesus said about the poor. But when I'm arguing with you, if you're not in my same faith area, I have to say, look, I may believe it for this reason, but I want to persuade you to believe it for reasons having to do with what's good for our country as a whole, regardless of why I came to that conclusion. And it seems to me all of us need to discipline ourselves in a conversation in a democracy, not to just impose sort of narrowly religious views on other people, even if the inspiration for our broader views does have a religious base.
I'm going to discipline myself and say amen. And thank you for being my guest, E.J. Dionne. Thank you for being on Humanities.
Oh, it's been great to be with you. Thank you very much.
The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the right to a fair and speedy trial, all of these, kind of ringing phrases were not originally part of the Constitution. And during the ratification process, that was one of the most important objections that people had to the Constitution, was that it didn't adequately protect people's individual rights. And so when it was ratified, the Constitution was ratified with the understanding that a Bill of Rights would be added to the Constitution. And so what we call the Bill of Rights are those first 10 amendments. The Constitution did not create a perfect plan. I mean, all throughout the Revolutionary period, slavery was a fact of life in all of the colonies. It existed in all of the colonies. And it was one of the most divisive issues of the time. It nearly tore apart the Constitutional Convention. It wasn't resolved by the Constitutional Convention. And still, the Constitution was adopted, and it took a civil war fought in the next century before the issue of slavery was resolved. Before the American Revolution, before the war broke out, there was a decade of peaceful protests in which the colonists were affirming their rights as loyal British subjects. And it was only after about a decade of peaceful protests that it became apparent that they were never going to achieve their rights, that war erupted and was later fought. These Americans were very hesitant to create a government which empowered any central authority that would be a threat to the liberties that had been so hardly fought. And so that is why the first 10 amendments, that protect, basic individual liberties was called for by the American people. We get about 1 million people who come to the National Archives each year, primarily to see the Charters of Freedom. And there are a lot of different ways to learn about the charters and to learn about our early history. But there is something unique about coming to see the original document. Somehow it feeds the soul and puts us in touch with what it is that engendered the birth of this country and has sustained the American people as a people through more than 2¼ centuries.
Our question was, do you believe that the United States fulfilled the promise of racial equality and equal opportunity?
And your group came up with, what was it?
Was it a yes?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you these questions in a true-false format. I want you to answer this way. If the answer is correct, make your arms in a big circle like that. Okay? If the answer is false, X. Okay? Rosa Parks was the secretary of the local NAACP chapter, leader of the youth group, and she had an important history of activism before the boycott. True or false? I said. True or false? This is true. This is false. Okay. It is true. Okay. Most people, when you hear the story of Rosa Parks, you hear about this little old lady who was tired, and she sat down on the bus, and the police officer picked her up. She was 42 years old. That's not old. Yes, it is. Well, she wasn't a little old lady, okay? And she was an activist. She was a very serious activist long before. They were looking for a case like this, okay? And she was the third person that year who sat down on the buses in Montgomery, Alabama to challenge the segregation law, okay? She was not tired. She did it deliberately.
What do you notice? What do you notice? What do you wonder? By what period has it changed? And is the school ever integrated? Is the school ever integrated?
Schools was interesting. I didn't know it was a big landmark. Because I used to live around the corner. I actually used to go to school up the street, Queen of Peace, and I never knew this really still existed.
I've been hiding for much too long, 'cause I've been too afraid to let it show. Scared of the judgment that may follow. Always putting off a living for tomorrow.
Us as the young people, we make the future, and we do have to buckle down and stay in school, and school is very important.
It's time to step out on faith. I gotta show my faith.
The question is, do you believe that the United States fulfilled the promise of racial equality and equal opportunity for all people? If you believe that they did not, raise your hand first. Well, someone in your group take a vote, count for us. How many people? If you believe they did not fulfill the promise, raise your hand. $29, so somebody write it up here. Grab a marker and write it in. So at the bottom, how about one of the people whose group it is? 29 for no. If you believe that they did, that the United States, if you believe the United States fulfilled the promise of equal rights and opportunity, racial equality, raise your hand if you believe yes. Okay, I'll take the count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Why did you go yes? Support your arguments. Pens.
Okay. At first, we all was like no or whatever,
I was explaining to him why I thought it was yes, because the question was about, has the United States fulfilled a promise of racial equality and equal opportunities? I've never single-handedly not been able to get a job from the government. I got a summer job every single year, so I can't say that I haven't had an equal opportunity. And maybe when I'm older, I can say that if I've been denied a job because I'm black or because I'm a female, but that hasn't happened to me in my life, in my experiences. And I believe that I had racial equality. I haven't had any racism from the government, the United States of America. When I tried to get my passport, nobody told me no because I was black. So that's why I was explaining to him that right now, in this point in our life, we may not necessarily get racial equality and not be denied for a job at this point in our life. Maybe further on in 10 years, or when you apply for a job from somebody else, or when you have a degree and that type of thing, and you're trying to get a job outside of working at TBS and all that type of thing.
Okay,
And
sound
so,
argument. It's a good argument, yeah.
From what you said, that was based on your experience of getting a job very similar, but not everybody's experience having equality, because most of the time it depends on what you look like and everything. That people just basically say that, oh, he's not qualified to get a job because he dressed like a thug or anything, or if it's somebody that comes in, somebody could come in having looking like Tupac or something like that, but could be smarter than Bill Gates or something like that. But then he ended up getting a job because of his way of thinking, because of the way he dresses. But really, it depends on what questions you ask him when it comes to the interview, because most of the time people don't try to find out how smart they are, because they could be smarter than anybody else and they could be the next president or whatever. And it depends on what's in their mind and not what they wearing. So I mean, people look at them as a racial profile about what they're wearing when they don't take the time to find out how smart they are.
Okay, very good.
That there's nothing extraordinary about me. I'm a very ordinary person. I had a very challenged background like so many people in the District of Columbia. And I say that simply to say that, one, I commend you for being here when you could be somewhere else. And secondly, take advantage of every opportunity that's before you. Because as people like myself move on, we're going to have to feel comfortable that behind us are young people who are going to take up the mantle of leadership and carry this city forward. Because this city is your city. This government is your government. These schools are your schools, and the families of the future will have to come from you all. And if you all take the challenge, then I can move on in the future feeling comfortable that our future is secure.
Strength, courage, and wisdom is inside of me all along. Strength, courage, and wisdom inside.
Oh, beautiful, for heroes proved in liberating strife. Who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life. America, America, make God thy gold refined, till all success